The story of Yosef and his brothers spans 4 parashiot and comes to an end in today's Parashat Vayehi. Over these weeks, we have witnessed one of the most remarkable transformations in the Torah. Yosef begins as a favored son, gifted and self-absorbed, a dreamer whose brilliance is inseparable from his narcissism. He's stripped of his coat, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and yet, again and again, he rises from slave to overseer, from prisoner to prince, from exile to power. Yosef is a self-made young man. He is gifted, wise, handsome, and inspired. Elie Wiesel wrote that Yosef is one biblical figure who learns how to transform exile into kingship, misery into splendor, humiliation into mercy. Yosef fascinates us because he makes the impossible possible. He outsmarts his enemies, resists temptation, survives betrayal, and always emerges stronger than those who seek to destroy him. The tradition grants him the extraordinary title, Yosef HaTzadik, Yosef the righteous. And Yosef's power extends well after his death. Even after his death, Yosef's righteousness is said to perform miracles. Explaining the verse we sing in Hallel, Hayam ra'a vayanos, the sea saw and fled. The Midrash tells us that when the Sea of Reeds saw the coffin of Yosef descending into the water, the Holy One said, "It is written of Yosef, and he fled and went outside, vayanos, vayetze achutza," when he resisted the advances of Potiphar's wife. Therefore, the sea too will flee before him. The tradition also tells us that Israel's exile and suffering over the centuries were set in motion by what the brothers did to Yosef. The consequences of this story ripple forward into history. After all its tribulations, the story of Yosef has a good ending. In last week's parasha, Vayigash, Yosef reveals himself to his brothers, draws them close, and reassures them. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me here. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It was all God's plan, he tells them. There is no retaliation, no revenge, no punishment. Did Yosef forgive them? It's not clear. Perhaps it was, as Marilyn Robinson writes in Reading Genesis, elevating these events, bitter as they are in themselves, to the level of divine providence, lifts them beyond the reciprocities of injury and revenge, beyond the reach of justice. This is not a pardon, it is grace. In any case, Yosef refuses to be imprisoned by grievance. Yosef heals his broken family and allows it to survive. All's well that ends well. Right? Not quite. It doesn't all end that well. There's another side to the story of Yosef. At the opening of this week's parasha, Vayehi, the Torah tells us Yaakov lived 17 years in the land of Egypt. And when the time approached for Israel to die, he summoned his son Yosef and said to him, "Please do not bury me in Egypt. Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed at the head of the bed. Yaakov bows down to his son Yosef. Rashi quotes the Talmud. Though the lion is king, when the fox has its time, bow to him. Though the lion is king, when the fox has his time, bow to him. It is a startling image. Yosef is not called a lion. Pharaoh is the lion. Yosef is the fox, clever, adaptive, shrewd. Yaakov bows not because it is fitting for a father to bow before his son, but because it is necessary. Rashi explains why Yaakov bows. He doesn't explain why Yosef accepts it. How does Yosef allow his father to bow before him? The Midrash teaches that 10 times Yosef hears his brothers refer to Yaakov as your servant, our father, and Yosef remains silent. Silence is consent, and for failing to correct this dishonor, Yosef's life is shortened by 10 years. He dies in this week's Parashat at the age of 110 instead of 120, as would have been fitting for a tzaddik. This opens the door to a very different side of Yosef, one far less comforting and far more disturbing. The Yosef who fascinates us, who rises against all odds, who is able to be gracious towards his brothers, is the same Yosef who designs Egypt's economic system during the famine. When the famine becomes severe, Yosef does not distribute food freely or as part of a humanitarian relief effort. He sells it. When the Egyptians' money runs out, he takes their livestock. When the livestock is gone, he takes their land. Finally, he takes their bodies. In a few short verses, Yosef transfers all wealth, all land, and all labor into Pharaoh's hands. The people say to him, "You have saved our lives. Let us be servants to Pharaoh." Yosef hears gratitude, but we hear something else. Remarkably, the Torah and the commentaries are largely silent about Yosef's ruthlessness. Rabbi Shai Held notes the terrible irony. Yosef, brought to Egypt as a slave, becomes Egypt's enslaver. Rabbi Held writes, Yosef displays remarkable administrative prowess, but he unleashes forces that eventually end up oppressing and degrading his own people. It is hard to imagine that the Torah makes no moral judgment at all on Yosef's setting this destructive process in motion. When the Torah imagines Israel's life in the land, it prohibits the permanent selling of land and limits slavery to a limit of 6 years. Permanent enslavement is unthinkable. In other words, the Torah passionately prohibits the Israelites from doing to one another what Yosef does to the Egyptian people as a whole. Yes, Yosef saves lives, but he also builds the system of bondage, and the system he designs will one day enslave his own people. Yosef, the dreamer and dream interpreter, can read economic cycles with prophetic clarity, but he cannot imagine a social order beyond an oppressive empire. And here, a deeper pattern comes into focus. Yosef's life is a hard and painful education in powerlessness, betrayed by his brothers, sold, imprisoned, forgotten, His trauma teaches him one lesson. Survival depends on mastering the system. He masters it, but he doesn't challenge it. So when power finally comes to him, Yosef uses it brilliantly and ruthlessly. He is magnanimous when he's face to face with his brothers, with his family. There, he feels, he weeps, he remembers he's capable of forgiveness or grace and of seeing God's providential life-saving plan. But as a public figure, Yosef has internalized the structures of power so completely that he no longer knows how to step outside it. To refuse his father's bowing down to him would have meant taking the risk of disrupting the structure of power. His trauma taught him not to take those risks. So Yosef is a tzaddik, but a tragic one. He saves lives and harms an entire society. He's capable of forgiveness and grace, and at the same time, he's blind to the destructive effects of his own power. Yaakov bows down to him, but he asks Yosef for one thing: do not bury me here. Egypt is not the final destination. Egypt must not have the last word. The fox's hour is real, but it is not eternal. Parashat Vayehi ends with survival, a family reunited, and the prelude to Israel's enslavement by the very system Yosef created. This is where the Torah leaves us at the end of the book of Bereshit. Living with both sides of Yosef, the tzaddik and the enslaver, means refusing to simplify ourselves or our world into heroes or victims. The tradition idealizes Yosef, calling him a tzaddik, and is largely silent about his darker side. Yosef's brilliance, his skill, even his grace with his brothers did not come for free. They are inseparable from the suffering he endured and from the parts of himself he had to deny in order to survive. To survive and to acquire power, he had to suppress his vulnerability and his moral imagination. The cost of that survival is that he cannot fully inhabit every part of himself. His tears before his brothers are just a glimpse of what he had to suppress. We too have idealized ourselves as a people, chosen, clever, creative, resilient. That is what we needed in order to survive. And yet dwelling in our idealization or in the memory of our suffering can blind us to the consequences of our power. We risk justifying what we do, even when it harms others, even when we participate in systems that oppress. Embracing the complexity and acknowledging both sides of Yosef means being willing to see the impact of our actions and to ask again and again how we act with justice, restraint, and moral courage. Silence, especially in the face of harm or injustice, is never neutral. We live in a moment that mirrors Yosef's contradiction, a time in which we are both vulnerable and powerful, both threatened and influential, both capable of grace and capable of harm. We know about pits, betrayal, exile, suffering, and survival. We know that antisemitism is alive and on the rise. And we also know what Jewish power and rage can do. We know what it means to be part of systems that determines who lives and who suffers. Yaakov's final request, do not bury me in Egypt, is a reminder. Power may be necessary, but it must never become home, never an end in itself. The book of Bereshit ends with survival, but survival is not enough. We must not settle for being clever or resilient at the cost of our moral vision. Compassion, kindness, human solidarity, and the pursuit of righteousness are also our legacy. And next week, Parashat Shemot. Shabbat Shalom.